Bill Hybels is a well-known preacher, teacher, and author, and in one of his books, he tells of an observation he made while he was growing up. His father owned a large produce company, and they implied a wide diversity of people, everything from truck drivers and dock workers to salespeople and managers. And as a result, they had their share of relational issues, people who would get irritated with one another or hurt by something someone said, and sometimes there was even sharp disagreement. However, whenever there was any kind of conflict among the employees, Hybels said that they would always go into the banana room. Now, the banana room was a temperature-controlled room that would contain up to 800 cases of bananas. It was completely enclosed, and there was a 4-inch thick steel door on it so that nobody on the outside could hear what was on the inside. So, whenever anyone came up to you and said, "I need to see you in the banana room," there was a natural hesitation. It meant that there were some things that needed to get straightened out and the air needed to be cleared up a bit. However, Hybels also goes on to say that from his observation, no one ever actually died in the banana room. In fact, he said that there was usually some measure of reconciliation, and often the people who would come out of the banana room would come out patting each other on the back and smiling to one another. The banana room. Living in the kind of world in which we live, a fallen world, one of the inevitabilities of life is conflict. It's something that we all see and experience at virtually every level of our lives, don't we? The international level, the national level, the community level, in our homes. The other day, Carol and I were having dinner with a couple of our friends, and they have a 6-year-old granddaughter. And they were telling us that not long ago, their son called, and when Patsy answered the telephone, her son said, "Mom, you have got to talk to your granddaughter." And she said, "Why? What's the problem?" He said, "Never mind, you have got to talk to your granddaughter." And he handed the phone to her. And when the granddaughter got on the phone, Patsy said, "Mary Jane, what's the problem?" She said, "Gigi, I am so frustrated by my mom and dad right now. It's always Mary Jane do this and Mary Jane do that." Well, we experience conflict at virtually every level of our lives, don't we? Dare we say it, sometimes even in the church. At the same time, it's a subject that I think most of us would probably much rather avoid. I'll confess to you, when I first started looking at the gospel lesson for this week, I almost quickly moved on to one of the other lessons. Why? Because I knew that the moment I brought up the subject of conflict, eyebrows would go up and some people would start asking questions. They'd begin wondering what's going on in the church. Who's mad at Dan? Better yet, who's Dan angry at? Let me just say from the outset, there is no hidden agenda here. In fact, one of the reasons I decided to go ahead and talk about the subject of conflict is because sometimes the best time to teach about it is when there is none that is actually going on in the church. Jesus knew the importance of teaching about conflict. It's why he dealt with it on numerous different occasions. On one occasion, you may recall that he stressed the importance of dealing with conflict in a timely manner. On another occasion, he told his disciples, "Pray for those who persecute you." In other words, conflict is not just a relational issue, it's also a spiritual issue. And here in our gospel lesson this morning, Jesus seems to focus on how to deal with conflict. Now, part of the reason that I believe Jesus does this is because Jesus knows that there are some very unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict, ways that deepen the divide, ways that destroy our witness in Christ, undermine fellowship within the community of faith, and even chip away at our own self-esteem. For example, if you look behind the scenes of what Jesus is saying, more at what he doesn't say. He almost seems to suggest that one of the unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict is to simply ignore it. Pretend that it doesn't exist, and maybe it will go away. Now, I alluded to this a couple of weeks ago when I preached on the subject of reconcilable differences. And if you were here that Sunday, you may recall that I mentioned the fact that one of the problems with taking the approach of ignoring hurt or conflict when it is there is that it doesn't really go away. It just goes underground, where it can't be controlled and where it can do real damage. If you look behind the scenes, you'll also discover that Jesus seems to suggest that another unhealthy way of dealing with conflict is to adopt an attitude of win at all cost. And the basic premise behind this approach to dealing with conflict is do whatever it takes to come out on top, including aligning allies or spreading rumors or even taking a shot or two at a person's character. I love the story that Paul Harvey tells of the elementary school that was having a literary contest. The students were to dress up like one of the characters that they had read about, and one little boy came dressed in a tunic with a long staff, and one of the other kids saw him and said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Jesus." The other little boy said, "Well, to tell you the truth, you look more like Little Bo Peep." And as Paul Harvey was so fond of saying, and the rest of that story was that day, that little boy got a black eye from Jesus. If winning is your goal, then this is not a bad tact to take. But Jesus makes it clear that for those of us who call ourselves Christians, our goal goes beyond winning to seeking the best interest of everyone involved, which leads to the other reason that I think Jesus talked about how to deal with conflict. He also knew that there are some healthy ways of dealing with conflict, ways that open doors, increase dialogue, and actually lead to reconciliation. If you'll look closely, you'll notice Jesus encourages us to take the approach of loving confrontation. Loving confrontation. This is what lay behind those words of Jesus when he said, if someone has wronged you, then go directly to that person and deal with it alone. And if that doesn't work, then take a couple of other people with you and deal with it. And if that doesn't work, just bring the whole church with you. Now, when some people read or hear this, they think Jesus is being a little drastic or harsh here. They begin to wonder, surely Jesus can't mean that we're supposed to get the whole church involved in all of our conflicts, but that question misses the point. Basically, what Jesus is saying here is be so determined in your desire to love other people, so intentional about your desire to restore relationships, so radical in your commitment to set things right that you are willing to explore every avenue that leads to reconciliation. Jesus wants us to understand that regardless of who the other person is with whom we might have a conflict, that person is a child of God, and as a child of God is your brother, your sister, my sister, which means that there is more at stake in every conflict than just getting our way. Jesus also wants us to acknowledge his presence and allow him to come into the whole process of conflict resolution. Remember, it was in the context of this conversation about conflict that Jesus uttered those well-known words, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. In other words, when we allow Christ into the process of conflict resolution, something transformative has a way of taking place. Several years ago, I had an experience I don't think I will ever forget. At the time, I was serving a church that had a long driveway in it. It was a very steep incline, and one winter morning, Sunday morning, it started to snow and really snow, and we knew that people weren't going to be able to drive up that driveway, and if they did manage somehow to get up there, coming down could be a real problem. And so we did the obvious. We called off church. Well, sort of. Actually, one of the members of the church owned one of the local funeral homes. And so I called him up and I said, "You mind if we have church in the chapel of your funeral home?" And he said, "Sure." And so we made phone calls and got word out on the radio and other forms of media. And surprisingly enough, about a third of the congregation showed up. They were all just dying to get into the place. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that one. Right now, I don't remember what I preached on, but there must have been something about being in that place. Because after the service was over, this lady came up to me and she said, "Do you mind staying for a few minutes?" She wanted me to be a part of a conversation that she had with one of the doctors in the community who happened to be there that morning. I said, "Sure." And so after everybody else had left, we found one of the consultation rooms and we sat down and this lady began to talk. Years ago, her husband had died, and even though she had never told anyone about it, she harbored a deep resentment for that doctor because she blamed him for her husband's death. And as she explained all of this, there came a moment when she looked him square in the eye and she said, "I want to ask you to forgive me of harboring all of this resentment and bitterness towards you for all of these years." Well, it opened the door. And then they were really able to talk, and he was able to explain to her exactly what had happened. And their relationship began to grow closer and closer together, and it got better than it had ever been before. Listen, there are times when all of us need to go to the banana room, whether it's located in a large produce company or whether it's located in a consultation room of a local funeral home. And no, things may not always work out exactly the way you want them to, because sometimes one of the parties may not want reconciliation, at least not at that moment. That person may need more time, but here's the deal and the good news. When you allow Christ into the process, and when you adopt the approach of loving confrontation and radical reconciliation, then you have in your hand the key to the banana room. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news for this morning.